This morning's meeting is a public meeting, but in order to ensure adequate time for the consultation with the stakeholder group, members of the public will be in listen-only mode. There will be an ample opportunity for the public to comment on these proposed regulations, and we ask that you send your comments to the email address astormcomments.mde@maryland.gov. Finally, it's important to note that MDE has not formally proposed any new stormwater management regulations. When we do, we will promulgate the regulations through the Maryland Register. This will start the formal public commenting period as part of the regulation adoption process. I will talk more about these commenting opportunities at the end of today's meeting. Everyone that is signed up for today's meeting is on our stormwater regulations interested parties list and will be notified when the department formally proposes the regulations in the Maryland Register. If someone that you know who is not here today but wants to be on this list, please have them send a request to the above referenced email. The stakeholder group's formation was stipulated in the law and requires that the department consult with this group regarding the stormwater regulatory proposals. The department shared the latest proposal with the stakeholders on February 6th and has posted them on the A-StoRM website for everybody to see. Hopefully, everybody's had some time to get more familiar with them. May I ask the stakeholders to please use the chat function now to introduce yourselves and identify the group that you represent. If you are new to Zoom meetings, you will find the chat function and all of the functions that you will need today to participate at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is one of the 4 icons found on the bottom right of your screen. I have highlighted on this slide the chat symbol with a yellow arrow. The raise hand function, camera, mute, and unmute functions are located on the bottom center of your screen. We ask that for the rest of today's meeting, unless you are talking, please mute yourself and turn your camera off to ensure the quality of today's presentation. Okay, let's get started. The introductions I can see are now coming in from the stakeholder group on the chat. Please keep them coming in. First off today, we're going to have Jennifer Smith, and she's going to provide us with an overview of the regulatory update process. Next, I will be providing for both the stakeholders and the public some context for commenting on the regulations today. And then the main portion of today's meeting, Stuart Comstock will be leading us through Maryland Stormwater Regulatory Draft Proposal. As mentioned on our earlier slide, there will be pauses throughout today's meeting for questions and answers. And finally, at the end of today's meeting, I will go over the next steps with the group. So with no further ado, Jennifer.
Good morning, everybody. Before we get started today on talking about the details of today's proposal, first I want to recognize and thank the Stakeholder Advisory Group members for joining us today and let you know that your input is very important to us. And I'll be talking a lot today about the comments that we have received from you all. So thank you again for joining. And I also want to recognize the members of the public that have joined and thank you for your interest in this important information, as well as I believe we have some members from our other advisory groups. We've asked the regulations technical advisory group members and the watershed studies technical advisory group members to join us as members of the public. So those of you from those groups, thank you again for joining us as well. So today, what I would like to do just briefly before we turn it over to Stu to go into the details, I want to talk about the history of stormwater management regulations in Maryland. and then talk a little bit about how our proposals for these updates have evolved. First, let's talk about our regulations and the history behind them. Our first stormwater regulation in Maryland was posted in 1982, and the focus in 1982 was on flood control. 2-year and 10-year peak management or quantity management was required at that time for all new development projects. This means managing the discharge rate from a 2-year or a 10-year storm event from the post-development condition back to the pre-development condition. So these regulations were in place for about 8 years, and then in the year 2000, the focus changed. The focus became water quality treatment and channel protection, stream channel protection. So at that time, there were regulations added to treat the first inch of runoff from storms, and the quantity management requirement that was in place prior was modified from a statewide everywhere requirement to only being required in areas known to flood. These regulations were in place for another 9 years, and then in 2009, the regulations changed once again. At this time, water quality treatment and channel protection were still important, but the focus changed to mimicking the hydrology of a forested condition for stormwater rainfall, and again, leaving quantity management to be required statewide, but only in areas where the local jurisdiction had knowledge of flooding events or in conveyance problems. So these regulations are in place today, and they are known as the ESD to the MEP, or environmental site design to the maximum extent practicable. Could I have the next slide, please? So today, 13 years later, it's been 13 years since the last stormwater regulation update, and we find ourselves with a changing climate. And this changing climate is impacting Maryland's rainfall patterns, and it's leading to flooding, more flooding in areas that we know are at risk for flooding, but also in areas not previously known to be at risk for flooding. So in order to understand this and begin to minimize the impacts of climate change, we need to recognize that there are some gaps in our current stormwater management regulations and our programs, and there are some gaps in floodplain programs as well. For example, as I said earlier, quantity management now being required statewide, but where the local jurisdictions determined it is necessary. This leads to varying degrees of quantity management across the state, and this is especially important when we have watersheds that cross jurisdictional boundaries. We have no mandate currently in state law to manage cumulative hydrologic impacts of all of these development projects on the local or the FEMA floodplains. We have many existing stormwater conveyance systems that are undersized because their designs were based on outdated precipitation data. And there's no state regulation for conveyance system design. These systems are designed based on local jurisdiction requirements. And again, when watersheds cross jurisdictional boundaries, this can be a problem. Many of these conveyance systems are not located on maps, and they have not been assessed for condition or even for capacity. All this leads to the need for more data and data sharing. And this will require better communication and coordination on these flooding issues between jurisdictions and various levels of government. Next slide. So with this in mind, the General Assembly has charged us with updating our stormwater regulations to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Now, MDE has been working on these updates since early 2022. In June of 2022, we did form the Stakeholder Consultation Group. And as a group, we met several times over that summer to discuss climate change and its impacts on precipitation and flooding, how precipitation information is used to design stormwater management practices, and some of the history behind the stormwater management regulations and their development. We have since then provided 2 proposals for regulation updates to this group, and we've received many comments. These proposals and the comments received and today's proposal are posted on MDE's A-StoRM website. Ray, if you go back to the previous slide, I have a link to that website on this slide, and if I could ask somebody to put that link in the chat, that would be great. Okay, now you can go to the next slide, please. So MDE's proposals for stormwater regulation updates have evolved over time, and this is primarily due to the comments that we've received from you. Our initial proposal was meant to address what we consider the quickest or maybe even the easiest to implement, or the low-hanging fruit. First, we focused on updates to our design storms using more recent precipitation data. And then to incorporate future rainfall projections for this first proposal, we proposed an increase in the ESD volume requirement. This increase was based on NOAA's Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment future climate change projections. This was essentially the average projected increase for Maryland under a mid-level emission scenario for the time period between 2050 and 2070. I'm not going to go into the details of how that information is developed, but for more information about these projections, you can visit the MRISA website. There's a link here on this slide for you if you're interested. And if I could ask somebody to put that link in the chat, that would be great. So on this first proposal, MDE received many comments, and they were generally favorable. But you all asked us to do more. You asked MDE to incorporate future rainfall projections into all of our design storms. We heard from you that there should be an increase in the required ESD volume, but there were different opinions on how much that increase should be and how it should be managed. But most of you agreed that to be resilient to a portion of this volume, the ESD volume, should not be managed in ESD practices, but instead should be managed in more resilient structural practices. And the majority of you recognized that more needs to be done to address flooding, and not just to be focusing on preventing it from getting worse. So our second proposal for regulation updates was focused on ensuring our stormwater BMPs that we install are more resilient to the impacts of climate change, especially the impacts of high-intensity, short-duration storms. MDE agreed with many of the stakeholder comments, that ESD practices do not contribute significantly to flood control, especially for larger storm events. MDE agreed with many stakeholder comments that ESD practices should be designed to manage the most common storms that are not predicted to change with climate change. And MDE also agreed with many stakeholders that ESD practices are not able to provide adequate channel protection as originally envisioned. So our second proposal separated the practices to be used for ESD volume and channel protection volume, with channel protection required to be managed in more resilient structural BMPs. This left ESD practices to be designed offline to focus on managing water quality and groundwater recharge. In addition, to improve our management of flooding, MDE proposed updates to all design storms to incorporate future climate change projections. And we proposed new requirements for quantity management for all new development projects statewide. In this case, The design storms for these projects would be determined by the local approval authorities depending on the downstream flood risk. Again, we received many comments, and they were generally favorable, especially to decoupling the management of channel protection from the management of water quality. The comments were also favorable to ensuring that channel protection volume is managed in a more resilient practice. But many of you noted that the department was overzealous and that we went too far, especially in requiring the runoff from 3 inches of rainfall to be managed in an ESD practice, and that a separate additional volume of runoff from the 1-year storm be managed for channel protection in a structural practice, and that this resulted in a management volume increase of more than double what is currently required. There was, however, general support to require quantity management for all development projects, but it was noted that the proposal was too complex and may not achieve the flood protection we were hoping for. So, with these comments, today's proposal builds on what we have learned and the comments that we've received on the previous 2 proposals. Today's proposal includes a simpler approach to minimizing the impacts of development from local flooding. Today's proposal includes a requirement to ensure adequate conveyance. Today's proposal includes quantity management of the 10-year storm to be required for all development projects, and that a downstream conveyance capacity analysis is required. And today's proposal includes an ESD volume requirement that is based on a larger but regional average annual rainfall amount. Next slide. Now, Stu's going to go over all of what I just said for today's proposal again in more detail. I did want to add this slide here, which essentially summarizes what I just described for each of the proposals. I'm not going to go over this now. This is here for you to look at on your own time, but it does provide a progression of how the proposals have evolved with each of the stormwater management goals. Now, before I stop, I did want to recognize that MDE received many comments from environmental organizations, the design community, and regulators alike, that addressing stormwater regulations for new development alone will not be enough to solve flooding in Maryland, and that more needs to be done. And we want you to know that MDE agrees. I have paraphrased some of these comments here. I recognize the slide has many words, but I think it's important to read them and to consider them as we go through today's presentation. So, to address flooding and climate change impacts, more needs to be done. We're going to need to design for future rainfall patterns and determine whether to use shorter duration rainfall in creating required design storms. We're going to need to continue to study downstream and overland flooding and to address the growing issue of overwhelmed conveyance infrastructure. We're going to need to evaluate a whole watershed approach to stormwater management that includes watershed-specific quantity management practices for development projects, as well as regional solutions to correct existing deficiencies. We are going to need to update existing watershed studies to model flood risk based on existing and future development scenarios. We are going to need to create both a model ordinance for watershed management and a toolbox for watershed managers to create specific solutions that holistically address known flooding issues and establish the most appropriate requirements for future land uses. We are going to need to modify, reduce, and possibly even eliminate competing local regulatory requirements that impede the implementation of watershed level solutions. And we're going to need to continue to engage stakeholders, local governments, and other state agencies. So while MDE is committed to updating our stormwater regulations, we are also continuing to do more. because managing flood risk in Maryland is complex and it requires a comprehensive and multifaceted approach. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ray, who's going to talk about how MDE is going to get all of this done. Ray, you are on mute.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Thanks for the overview of how we got to this meeting today and the regulatory updates and more importantly, sharing the department's bigger picture of the watershed management approach that we're striving to achieve. There's a lot stipulated in the law and a lot of information that Stu's going to be providing for you today in updating the state stormwater management regulations. This slide is showing us the charge. It kind of boils it all down to help us keep focused during today's meeting. And basically, we can all agree that the climate is changing and the law requires us to implement updated regulations without delay. But we also need to make sure that we do this right, because what we do will significantly affect our infrastructure, communities, and people's lives. So how will Maryland's community, stormwater community, respond to this? And when I talk about community, I really mean all of us, the department, the stakeholders, the public, really everyone that has a role in Maryland's stormwater management and flood mitigation programs. So to help us in framing our response, we would like to pose a few fundamental questions up front for you to keep in mind as we go through today's proposals. Questions that can help us to answer which proposals to move forward without delay. In a few minutes, Stu will be leading us through in more detail the department's most recent set of stormwater regulatory proposals. And as he's going through them, ask yourself, which of these or parts of these proposals do you think that we can move forward with now and that will have little or no unintended consequences? Which proposals, from your perspective, do you have confidence in for the department to move forward with? And finally, what are we missing? What additional ideas do you have that can help us improve these regulations? A primary factor that will determine what proposals we can move forward with is the amount of work involved with making the changes. These barbells represent 4 different levels of effort that we have used throughout today's presentation to share our assessment of where we think the department is with each proposal and what we believe is needed to finish the job. Some items, like updating the precipitation data, are going to be easier than others. This is because the data are readily available, and it will be fairly easy to update the data tables found in the manual, and it will also be fairly straightforward to plug the data into existing equations for designing BMPs. Other items, like ensuring downstream conveyance stability, may be more difficult. This is because there are more open-ended questions that still need to be answered, and potentially more analysis, modeling, and piloting that we need to do before we're ready to move forward with these regulations. There may also be parts of each proposal that we have confidence in moving forward with, and other parts that need more study. So in your consulting role today and helping us to determine the next steps of what to implement, be thinking of where we are with each proposal, what level of confidence you have in the proposals, and what additional work needs to happen for us. Our assessment of where we think the department is with each proposal and what we believe is needed to finish the job. I think I've talked about some of this. I was talking about ensuring downstream conveyance stability, and that may be more of a difficult lift. And there may be parts of proposals that you're going to see today that we can move forward with. We don't have to move ahead with everything all at once. So this is really for the consultants, but for the public as well. In your role today, in helping us to determine the next steps of what to implement, be thinking of where we are with each proposal, what the level of confidence you have in the proposal, and what additional work needs to happen for us to accomplish these tasks, making sure that we get them done right. And of course, getting them done right always leads us to a discussion of resources. I've included on this slide several examples of recent stormwater design manual updates and their costs. The department has been applying for EPA, FEMA, and NOAA grants for implementing this regulatory update and for pursuing the watershed approach that Jennifer was talking about. We've been fairly lucky getting FEMA money for prioritizing and repairing some of our high hazard dams across the state. And we believe that we're on the cusp of receiving up to $3 million from FEMA for developing a watershed prioritization tool. We've not had so much luck getting grants for this stormwater regulatory update, but recently we've secured some seed money to fund the Maryland Environmental Services to help us find grants for updating our manuals. So one request that we have for both the stakeholders and the public is if there are grants that you know about that we might be eligible for, or if you want to coordinate with us on a pilot project, let us know and please send me an email. But of course, the resources are more than just money. We want to tap into the expertise of this group. Some of you, in your comments back to us, have already been tinkering with the numbers and providing us with design example updates. To this, we say thank you, and let's continue this work together and figure out a way to develop this information as part of our design guidance. Some of you are conducting further research on precipitation and new stormwater management practices. How can we leverage your efforts to benefit this regulatory process by providing new and innovative practices in our design manual? Others on this call today are very good at providing outreach to the public on environmental and stormwater issues. How can we make use of these efforts to more effectively promote and support updates to Maryland's stormwater management program? So if it sounds like I'm soliciting for help, I am. So if you can think of any way that your group can help us to further this regulatory process, pick up the phone and give us a call. We'd love to work with you. And now I'd like to introduce Stuart Comstock. If you know him, you know that he is the best person to articulate the department's proposals for stormwater management. Now, while you've received a full set of the regulatory proposals and support materials, we're going to be going through the lion's share of those proposals today. We're not going to be able to get through them all, so be sure to read through them all before submitting your comments into the department. Today's focus will be on quantity management. It's the component most directly related to flooding and the one that will provide us with the much needed resiliency that we are seeking today for the changing weather patterns that we are experiencing more and more. So Stu, take it away.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. First of all, before I start talking about what we're proposing to do, I want to go through a little ancient history. This slide shows you a section of the original stormwater regulations from back in 1982. By the way, this has also been unchanged. This is the exact same language that is in the current stormwater management regulations. Maryland's stormwater management program was originally set up as a comprehensive approach to mimic pre-development or natural runoff conditions, reduce channel erosion, enhance water quality, and reduce flooding in receiving waters. The stormwater management regulations originally applied to new development, and in 2000, we also added categories for redevelopment. As Jennifer described earlier, this program has shifted over the years from using large-scale practices to control discharge rates and flooding, and in order of preference to mimic natural conditions, to managing using smaller, more distributed practices to reduce runoff from more frequent storms and promote water quality and prevent excessive erosion in receiving stream channels. And more recently in 2009, to even more closely mimic natural or pre-development conditions. The current proposal that we're about to discuss realigns the program to promote resiliency, control local flooding while continuing to reduce runoff from smaller storms and more frequent storms in resilient practices. Next slide, please. But before we can discuss the changes to promote resiliency and control local flooding, we need to briefly discuss updates to Maryland's precipitation data. Currently, the Maryland Stormwater Design Manual includes the precipitation data that dates from 1961. Changes in the state stormwater management law in 2021 included a requirement to use the most recent precipitation data. The table in the manual 2.2 provides rainfall depths for the 1, 2, 10, 100-year, 24-hour design storms. Again, these are based on TP40 and are using Natural Resource Conservation Service hydrology models. The environmental site design requirements in the design manual, there's a minimum 1 inch that incorporates the water quality and recharge components that are based on capturing 90% of the average annual rainfall volume based on 1997 rainfall analysis that looked at information from 7 weather stations. And there's a maximum of 2.7 inches that incorporates the channel protection volume, which is based on the statewide median of the 1-year, 24-hour design storm, also from TP40. Next slide, please. So what we are proposing is to update the precipitation data using the Supplement 2 Table 1. NOAA's Atlas 14, which was published in 2006, is the most recent data available for precipitation and the distribution curves used for modeling rainfall and discharge. However, Atlas 14 does not include projected changes related to climate change. More recently, the Chesapeake Bay program's MARISA tool includes county-specific change factors that may be applied to the Atlas 14 rainfall data to adjust for changing climates. The MARISA tool does not include change factors for rainfall events less than the 2-year storm. To be conservative, we have applied the average 2-year storm change factor of 13% to the 1-year storm statewide. As newer information becomes available, this will be refined. We recognize that there are updates to NOAA Atlas 14 and a proposed NOAA Atlas 15 in development, and some of these may be available in 2025 and 2026. However, because we are required to include the specific edition or publication year in our regulations, we cannot automatically include these updates now. Regulations will need to be revised when these newer versions become available. Next slide, please. Okay. This is a copy of the Table 1 from the Supplement 2.2 that we put out. It's been slightly modified to make it easier to read in this format. And this reflects the most recent rainfall data and expected increases anticipated with changing climate. Because the climate changes from the MARISA tool are county-specific, Table 2.2, or this table here, provides county-specific values for the 24-hour design storms and not point location or station-specific values. Again, the MARISA tool did not include projections for the 1-year storm, and we applied the average projected increase from the 2-year 24-hour storm, or 13%, to this storm to promote resiliency in the channel protection criteria. Also, please note, the updated NOAA rainfall distribution curves must be used with the rainfall data in NOAA Atlas 14 and the MARISA-based projections when modeling stormwater discharges. The NOAA C curve applies to central and eastern Maryland, and the NOAA B curve applies to western Maryland, in this case, Washington, Allegheny, and Garrett counties. We received many comments that the stormwater regulations and the precipitation data should reflect regional variation. We agree. Currently, the state's water quality and channel protection criteria are based on capturing a specific volume from rainfall events as set forth in the design manual. As I just mentioned, the minimum requirement for providing environmental site design is based on the water quality criterion that was adapted in 2000, which is 1 inch for most of the state. And again, this was based on capturing and treating 90% of the average annual rainfall volume. That value was determined using a rainfall analysis from 7 weather stations across Maryland. The channel protection criterion was originally based on capturing the county-specific one-year 24-hour design storm as shown as from Table 2.2 from 2000. With the inclusion of channel protection as the upper limit for ESD, this was simplified to be the average one-year storm across Maryland, or 2.7 inches. Next slide, please. We have already discussed the rainfall data used for flood control and quantity management design and how these new values reflect county-specific changes. They are county-specific values. As part of the effort to promote resiliency and address climate change, the department is also proposing new rainfall values for the environmental site design criteria. These values are based on capturing 95% of the average annual rainfall volume. One of the comments received in our responses to our earlier proposals recommended that these criteria should account for the increased data now available and consider how precipitation varies across the state. In response, we have looked at rainfall records from 44 weather stations across the state, including the original 7, to determine the most appropriate values for ESD. Based on this information, we are proposing 2 rainfall zones. The western zone that includes Washington, Allegheny, and Garrett counties. In this zone, the rainfall for the water quality and recharge components of ESD is 1.4 inches. The central and eastern zone covers the remaining area of the state. In this zone, the rainfall for the water quality and recharge components of ESD is 2.0 inches. These values reflect the rainfall associated with capturing 95% of the average annual rainfall volume. Surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, these zones also align with the 2 NOAA distribution curves that reflect regional variation in rainfall patterns across the state. Next slide, please. This map shows the 2 rainfall zones in the state. The western zone is Washington, Allegheny, and Garrett counties. Data from the more recent analysis of rainfall records shows that Frederick County is actually part of the central rainfall zone. These zones also align with climate and rainfall distribution patterns developed by NOAA and for use with NOAA Atlas 14. Using this, capturing 1.4 inches of rainfall in Washington, Allegheny, and Garrett counties, and 2.0 inches of rainfall in the rest of the state would meet the 95% capture rule for meeting ESD. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do to implement some basic regulation changes now? Currently, the regulations do not include precipitation data. We have proposed an additional regulation to incorporate by reference the most current version of NOAA Atlas 14. We have analyzed the data and developed an updated Table 2.2 rainfall depths associated with specific 24-hour storm events. We are proposing a regulation to incorporate a new supplement to the design manual and plug this information in with minimal effort. These 2 regulatory changes will make NOAA Atlas 14 and the climate change adjusted design storms mandatory across the state. Next slide, please. As noted in several comments, a new version of Atlas 14 is in development. NOAA is also working on Atlas 15 that will include climate change projections. However, and again, we are required to specify the version and publication year in our proposed regulations. As these newer versions become available, we will need to propose new regulations to include the updated information. Also, the University of Maryland and the Maryland Department of Emergency Management have started deploying Maryland's Mesonet. This chain of automated weather sampling stations will provide better local data on rainfall patterns statewide. And as this information becomes available, it will help us to inform which design storms should be used for managing flood risks locally. This may include shorter duration events. So at this point, I'd like to take a quick pause and ask if there are any questions.
And just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, or you can type into the chat box. Okay, we have a question from Casey Reed. If you can try to unmute yourself, and if you have problems with that, then I can try to do that for you.
Nope, I think I got it. Stu, I was just curious if you could talk a little bit around your thought process and logic relative to the choosing both the time period and the RCP model relative to the MRISA tool for choosing the change factors that you ultimately applied to the NOAA data?
Casey, there's 4 change factors in the MRISA tool. There's 2 representative concentration pathways, and there's 2 time frames. There's a 2050 to 2070, and there's a 2100. Most other agencies, like State Highway, for example, are adopting a middle of the road approach, which is the same approach that we've adopted in this case to be consistent, which is, I believe, the 2050 to 2070 with the representative concentration pathway of 8.5. So that's what we're doing at this point. But again, for the smaller storms, the change factors didn't alter that much.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions? All right. We have the next slide, please. Resilient stormwater management requirements. Now that we have discussed changes to the precipitation information that form the foundation of the program, let's talk about changes to the various components that make up the state's resilient stormwater management requirements. Next slide, please. From the very beginning, managing local flooding has been part of the stormwater management program. However, since 2000, changes to the program have emphasized capturing runoff from smaller, more frequent storms to mimic natural rainfall runoff patterns and promote water quality and groundwater recharge. As climate patterns change, the stormwater program also needs to change to be more resilient. We need to do better at reducing local flooding and maintaining the capacity of storm drainage systems. We can accomplish this by revisiting aspects of the program that are already there. Because the focus of these changes to promote resiliency initially focus on managing local flooding and providing adequate downstream conveyance, we are going to begin with those aspects of the program first. Later, and as time allows, we will also discuss changes to the water quality and channel protection elements that form the environmental site design criteria. Next slide, please. So let's talk about managing flood risks from new development. The stormwater management program currently includes 2 criteria to reduce flooding in receiving waters. There's the overbank flood protection volume, or QP, that is designed to prevent increases in the frequency and magnitude of flooding from less frequent storm events like the 2-year and 10-year design storms that impact infrastructure design. And, excuse me, there's the extreme flood volume, or QF, that is designed to prevent flood damage from large storm events associated with floodplain boundaries.
Sorry to interrupt. It looks like we need to advance to the next slide.
Not yet. Give me a second.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's good. However, because there are no proposed changes to the extreme flood, no, you could advance to the next slide. Thank you, Michelle. However, because there are no proposed changes to the extreme flood protection volume at this time, we will focus on changes to the overbank flood protection volume, or QP. So currently, the QP requirement is based on managing the change between the existing and proposed conditions for a specific design storm. In this case, we're talking about the 10-year, 24-hour design storm. Currently, QP management for the 2-year and 10-year storms is required for new development locally if there is historical flooding and downstream development and conveyance system cannot be controlled. It is not required for redevelopment. Because the requirement is mandated locally, implementation is inconsistent across jurisdictional boundaries and within each jurisdiction. And, let's face facts, ESD was not intended to provide flood control. It is a big part of the solution, but is less effective during larger high-intensity storms. So what are we proposing? What have we proposed? QP management will be required statewide for both new development and redevelopment. The design criteria for QP management will be based on the 10-year, 24-hour design storm adjusted to reflect climate change. Many of you have asked why the 10-year, 24-hour design storm is required when local flooding may be caused by shorter duration high-intensity storms. However, more information is needed to better characterize local rainfall patterns and develop new design storm criteria. Absent that information, and recognizing that most storm drain systems and roadways are designed to safely convey the 10-year, 24-hour storm, we are proposing to use the 10-year, 24-hour storm as adjusted for climate change for now. Another comment suggested that 100-year peak management be required as part of these changes to resolve local flooding. As currently proposed, jurisdictions may use alternative design storms if there is an MDE-approved watershed study. This allows for flexibility to require shorter duration storms locally or larger storms like the 100-year storm where there is a demonstrated need. This proposal represents the first steps. This is needed to implement a consistent set of standards for flood control and to begin the development of local watershed management plans. Next slide, please. So what must happen for an acceptable regulation proposal? Currently, flood control requirements are found in the regulations and in Chapter 2 of the design manual. Control of the 2-year frequency event and 10-year frequency event, or both, is required by the design manual if any county or municipality determines that additional stormwater management is necessary because historical flooding problems exist. We have proposed a new regulation that requires managing flooding, and this can be done with minimal effort. However, there are existing policies found in the regulations that will need to be reviewed and updated. Also, there are standards found in the design manual that will also need to be updated as part of a supplement to ensure consistency across the manual. These efforts will take some more time to update. Next slide, please. As I just mentioned, the current standards for managing flooding are limited to 1 page in the design manual, and there have been many changes in the design and implementation of stormwater management for managing flooding since 2000. The information is very complex. More data analysis is warranted if we were to update the current standards to give us an enhanced regulation. As currently proposed, the requirement applies to all new development and redevelopment except where there is a direct discharge to tidal waters. There are many questions about how flood control management may be affected by watershed location and the timing of flow. These questions are site and watershed specific and are best answered with the development of watershed management plans that consider local flooding and conveyance system capacity. Storm drain systems are often designed using different hydrological models, for example, the rational method, than are used for stormwater management. As a result, the estimated discharge or capacity for a specific design storm may vary depending on which model you use. Currently, the state recognizes models like TR55 and TR20 that are commonly available. However, there are newer models and newer simulation methods that may be more suited to analyzing flooding and for watershed management studies. These are all items that we need to investigate and do more research on to give us an enhanced flood management regulation proposal. Next slide, please. Okay, many, including myself, have questioned why we're using the 10-year 24-hour design storm when local flooding may be caused by shorter duration, high-intensity storms. Is flooding driven by a 10-year 24-hour design storm, or is it something different? However, the most current precipitation information is insufficient to justify a change at this point. However, and I've discussed some of them, there are efforts both locally and nationally to gather the data needed to refine design requirements. As this data becomes available, we may modify this requirement to reflect that information. Finally, there are many questions about what should be used for the pre-development and post-development conditions. Many of you have heard me describe the situation where we provide flood management from the post-development conditions to the pre-development conditions. If we just change the storms that we are requiring from doing this management, all we are doing is technically taking the amount of water that we need to control. It's the same amount, it's pre-existing to post-development, and just sliding it up and down the scale of rainfall. Are we really providing more volume? So, should we use different rainfall rates, like the older numbers from TP40 versus the newer 2-year, 10-year found in NOAA 14? Or maybe we should manage the 10-year storm back to a 2-year storm, or a 25-year storm down to a 10-year storm. Currently, when designing for flood control, the standardized for characterizing existing land use is meadow. However, the standard for ESD is based on woods in good condition. These standards should probably be consistent. And finally, land development and construction methods have changed significantly since we developed the 2000 design manual. Current construction methods are resulting in the compaction of soils on site, and this is not reflected in our designs. Should this be considered in the modeling of post-development land uses and managing local flooding, and how do we address this? These are all questions that we need to answer and investigate if we're going to implement an enhanced regulation. Next slide, please. So I'd like to take another pause and answer any questions you might have about the flood management requirements. Casey.
Yeah, thank you, sir. A couple of questions on this one, and I'll just kind of throw them all at you at once, if that's okay.
That's fine. I'll throw it.
The relative to the application of QP controls for all projects, including redevelopment ones, are you considering any sort of exception for, particularly I'm thinking of very small redevelopment projects, like there is for channel protection, right? For example, if a project produced less than 2 CFS for that storm event, it's exempt from those requirements. Are you thinking of something similar for QP?
Again, we are, these are things that we need to investigate more, analyze more for enhanced regulation proposal. We'd like to discuss some of these opportunities with Regulations Technical Advisory Group. Certainly, watershed scale, location, timing of the hydrograph are all factors in flood management. And these are all factors that are influenced by what you just asked about that we need to look into. But they could be added or as we investigate them more and discuss them as a proposal down the road.
One other, particularly around the language of an MDE approved watershed study. Is there currently a process in place for that? My presumption is that the local jurisdiction would have to prepare the watershed study and then you guys would review and approve it. Is there a process for that currently?
Currently, the regulations have a clause in there about a MDE approved watershed studies. It is less specific about what is the content of those watershed management studies. That's something else we need to investigate.
The reason why I ask that question is just simply because if there's a process to be defined for that purpose, right, then potentially there's a lengthy interim period where there are no MDE approved watershed studies, right, to apply to the rest of the language that's in the currently proposed regulations.
It is our intent at this point that there's going to be a lag time between proposing regulations and them actually being implemented locally, that some of these efforts might continue through that time. But again, you recognize a very important point. Keep that in mind.
Thanks, sir.
Yep. I see I had 2 other questions. Karen, I think you were first, and then Neil. Karen?
Sure, thank you very much. Yeah, so in the document, we talk a lot about flood, and I see in the definitions of extreme flooding and flood extent, but when we're talking about effects on adjacent properties, it's unclear what you mean by flood. So it's just something I was wondering.
That's a good spoiler alert and a segue to the next topic. So hang on to that question and we'll answer it at the next break. That's a good one. Neil, go ahead.
Yeah, just real quick. As models get more sophisticated and complex over time, you're going to see the proposed accuracy be more and more. So, some of these models are only good for 25%. We're picking a rainfall data that's like 13 inches so it's exact. So how can we adjust? Is there a way to adjust that, or it's just going to be that number?
That's the problem with the different models. I would also point out to you, Neil, that depending on where you are in the state, some of these models may be more difficult to use or more difficult to review. I mean, you have to consider sometimes the lowest common denominator in your regulations as well. These are things that we're still looking into, and as we move forward, we hope to have answers for them.
Right, thank you.
We have one more question in the chat from Amy Stevens. She says, overbank flooding seems to only consider riverine flooding. Will this be expanded to include urban pluvial flooding?
Amy, that's a good question. And the intent here is to, again, because most storm drain systems were designed typically for a 10-year storm, the overbank flooding protection, or the QP flooding requirement now, is also targeting capacity of local systems. So yes, it would be coming farther up into the watershed to target the pluvial flooding where the capacity of the system is lessened. This is also a very good reason why we've extended this requirement to not just new development, but also to redevelopments where we have situations. This is very common in the city of Baltimore, where the existing storm drain system does not have the capacity for the 10-year storm. We can require management down to that level. Are there any other questions before I move on? Can I have the next slide, please? Now we're going to talk about the second component of managing flood risks, which is adequate downstream conveyance. Next slide, please. This slide shows you a section of the current law and the current regulations. The intent of the current law, which says the General Assembly intends by enactment of the subtitle to reduce as nearly as possible the adverse effects of stormwater runoff to safeguard life, limb, property, and public welfare. Reduce adverse effects of stormwater runoff, and this includes property. The stormwater regulations clearly state that it is the developer's responsibility to ensure that there's adequate conveyance onto downstream properties. Approval of a stormwater management plan does not create or affect any rights to direct runoff onto adjacent properties. The current regulation applies to all stormwater management plans as they address runoff and/or changes to runoff from development. However, the need to secure permission may vary from case to case. For example, flooding an adjacent property would likely need permission, while reducing existing runoff may not. The department has been advised to require verification that there is adequate conveyance for proposed discharges as early as possible in the development process. If the plan approval authority disagrees with the verification or the assessment of adequate downstream conveyance, then plans should not be approved. We have also been advised that asking for verification that activities are safe and lawful during and after construction is consistent with both the law and the stormwater regulations. However, how this is verified varies greatly in each jurisdiction, and there have been many drainage issues as a result. Next slide, please. Therefore, we are proposing a statewide requirement that, as part of a stormwater management plan, an adequate downstream conveyance analysis will be required to demonstrate that runoff from development projects does not create new or additional flooding or erosion impacts to downstream properties. This new proposal is providing more explicit criteria to meet the intent of the current law and regulation. An adequate conveyance analysis will be required from each point of discharge from a development site to a publicly owned or maintained drainage system. The proposal also allows increases in discharge to public drainage systems or easements, provided that the easements contain the flood extents of the post-developed design storm runoff. Next slide, please. On this simple image, the dashed blue lines are existing streams, waters of the U.S. The red lines show areas like rights-of-way, storm drain systems, or easements that are publicly owned or maintained. The dashed green lines indicate the location of a privately maintained conveyance system, and the blue arrows show flow paths of the runoff leaving this development site. The runoff discharging from the site at point 1 and point 2 flows into the public drainage systems, and the adequate downstream conveyance analysis should reflect that. However, at point 3, the runoff exiting the site flows into a private drainage system before entering the public drainage. And then, and in this case, an adequate downstream conveyance analysis would be needed to verify that there is no increase in the flood extents or erosivity from flow velocity for the 10-year, 24-hour design storm through that system to where the flow enters the public system. Verification is required to demonstrate that runoff conveyed through privately owned or maintained areas does not increase flooding or erosion. And the local jurisdiction is responsible for allowing runoff to enter their infrastructure, and they can be more restrictive and require management to a level of their infrastructure. Next slide, please. As discussed, This requirement applies to the development site and each point of discharge from that site. The proposal also allows increases in discharge to public drainage systems or easements, provided that the easements contain the flood extents of the post-development design storm. Next slide, please. Why are we doing this? We have received many complaints about downstream flooding from development projects where it is clear that a capacity analysis has not been done. It is not acceptable to advise downstream property owners to sue the developer. Today, we are discussing a new requirement to ensure that discharges from the site are adequately and safely conveyed to the receiving waters. We have all recognized that one of the effects of climate change has been an increase in local or pluvial flooding as the capacity of receiving conveyance systems is exceeded. Adding to this problem are the varying design standards and missing information for local storm drain systems. Next slide, please. So, I want to take a moment. We have received many comments about what we are doing to convey runoff within the development site, that big gray box on the earlier slide. The current design standards for conveying runoff to proposed BMPs within the development site are found in the design manual. We have received a number of comments that mention the conveyance of runoff within a proposed project. Comments like, stormwater runoff should be adequately conveyed to the practices managing runoff. Okay, I can agree with that. Overland drainage flow patterns should be evaluated to ensure that runoff reaches the BMP or BMPs that are designed to provide treatment. Okay. Adequate conveyance of runoff to new stormwater facilities is a requirement that MDE should consider. We agree. And we are evaluating ways to enhance the standards for ensuring runoff reaches the stormwater management BMPs. These standards must consider factors like location of the BMP within the development. Is that practice offline or part of the conveyance system? How is water being directed into that practice? What are the overflow and bypass criteria for those practices? And because these practices are within the site and much closer to the source of runoff, should we be considering shorter duration storms and higher discharges as we design conveyance to those systems? Next slide, please. Thank you. So what can we do to implement this now? We are proposing to move forward with the new regulation requiring an adequate conveyance analysis. Next slide. What must happen for an enhanced regulation proposal? The adequate downstream conveyance analysis requirement is new, and the information needed to properly implement this requirement is complex. What is considered an increase in flood? What is considered an increase in flood extent and or erosivity? How much change in elevation or discharge velocity is too much? What design storms should be used in this analysis? Is flooding being driven by a different design storm? Shouldn't the analysis reflect that? What other factors affect the analysis? For example, what if there is no public drainage system? Or it is undersized and not at capacity? It's not mapped. Who determines the capacity of that drainage system? Questions been asked a number of times. What models do we use? Storm drain systems aren't often designed to the same models we use for stormwater management. How accurate are the models? What if there's a difference between the model and reality? Okay, that's a good one. What if the developer can't get property access to properly do an analysis, like to survey cross sections? What if the developer can't get permission or rights to discharge from the adjacent property owner? These are all questions that we need to consider before moving forward with an enhanced regulation. I want to pause here again and take some more questions. Matt, you've got your hand up. Somebody unmute him.
I'm sorry, Matt Johnston is not one of the
Okay,
Stakeholder
thank you.
Advisory Group members.
Thank you, Michelle.
I just want to remind everyone from the public that we are accepting comments. You can email at, let's see.
Okay, Karen?
Yeah, just puzzling through all of this. I like your questions. I like what you're doing here. Just maybe one needs to address, I mean, there's the cumulative effect of many pieces of development in the same drainage shed that may cumulatively overwhelm the capacity of the public infrastructure, which of course is expensive to to renovate. So would you be anticipating any kind of like a performance improvement plan for local jurisdictions or something like that? And I know it's a difficult question, but you know, I'm pondering the cumulative effect of a lot of properties. If you get my drift of my question.
Karen, we do. One of the things we're trying to direct this program towards is locally implemented watershed management plans. You know, what you're asking about is exactly that. What is the capacity of the system, and how do I promote development within the watershed without exceeding the capacity of the system? To do that for a specific area, you really need to study what the problems are in that area, and then where the projects are located and what the timing is and all these other factors. That's a local watershed management plan. It's very similar to what Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is doing and some other local areas are doing. What we recognize at the state is that we can't do that statewide. We're working towards encouraging the local jurisdictions to do that. But in the interim, that's going to take more time. In the interim, we do need to start considering what is going on in downstream receiving waters and to downstream property owners. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess I'm still puzzling through whether there will be some kind of time frame for doing that, or like how do you prioritize your watersheds? You know, there's you know,
We have
whether it's by value of a stream extent or maybe the density of imperviousness or things like that.
we have a watershed management technical advisory group that's discussing many of those questions. So they're good questions.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay.
I believe Eric Michelson had a question.
Eric?
Thanks. I wasn't sure if I was able to, if I'm a member of the advisory committee or if I could ask the question.
Yes, you are. Go ahead,
Okay.
Eric.
Good. So my question is, are you all proposing to change the rules around the point of investigation location in terms of, I believe in Anne Arundel County, for instance, that was the point of investigation currently is something like the area downstream where the site is something like 10% of the contributing watershed. Is there a discussion about doing that sort of uniformly, or is that going to be more based on the cases that you're describing in terms of these tie-ins to the public drainage network and without any kind of regard for the size of the site itself?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, Eric, and correct me if I'm wrong, is policies within local design manuals and Arundel counties, for example, that relate to requiring flood management. The QP requirement. Where in the watershed do you need to do it, and how should it be done? And that is, part of the question about watershed timing and location that I mentioned earlier that we need to investigate more, because there are local policies out there that implement that. This adequate downstream conveyance requirement is more targeting the fact that, how does the water get to that point? And, as a local jurisdiction, and, you certainly are one of them, you have control over public drainage systems. So you know what your infrastructure is, and you can turn to an applicant and say, this system's overwhelmed, this is what you have to do. But we've received over the years far too many situations where that has not been done because the water is being discharged onto an adjacent private property. And we've seen private properties erode or be flooded. And so this requirement begins to get at that issue. What is too much flooding? What is too much erosivity? onto an adjacent property when that property is not publicly owned or maintained. And we've been advised by our Attorney General's office that we need to do more in that respect. And so this is what we're proposing.
And Karen Metchis, you have another question?
Yeah, so we've been discussing development and redevelopment. There's an increasing trend towards allowing what are they called? Small apartments or small tiny houses in your backyard to accommodate, family, or maybe someone's adding a impervious driveway or some other smaller scale change to their property. Are you going to be discussing waivers in your presentation today and requirements for those kind of small scale changes?
I think earlier under the flood management, and I will talk again more about it moving forward when I talk about the water quality changes. These are some of the specifics that are under discussion as opposed to when it is appropriate to implement an alternative compliance strategy. If something disturbs more than 5,000 square feet, stormwater management is required. However, for example, currently in the regulations, there are standard plans for agricultural development and for single-family residential lots. Clearly, those will have to be set aside while we develop new ones, but that would be part of an alternative compliance strategy that we need to investigate as well.
Okay, I don't think I saw in reading through your documents, you didn't address the single resident.
That's right. We didn't, because this is one of the questions we're talking with the Regulations Technical Advisory Group, because we're seeing different patterns of single lot family residential lot development depending on where you are. And so we need to be careful that we address in a reasonable manner alternative compliance pathways for those types of development.
Especially where perhaps there's not a watershed plan. I mean, it's going to take
Exactly.
a lot of, and what size watershed, and, drainage sheds, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's where a lot of the
Exactly.
flooding is happening. That sort of individual residents increasing their impervious footprint. And also the 5,000 square feet is area of disturbance, not just area of impervious cover, right?
If you disturb 5,000 square feet of land area and you're not agricultural land management activity, crops, pasture, you're required by state law to address stormwater management. How you address stormwater management, how you provide that stormwater management is what the local jurisdictions will review and approve. It might be an alternative compliance pathway if it's a small single family residential lot on the Eastern Shore. But that single family residential development in Montgomery County is a completely different issue.
Right.
So that's why we have to work very closely with our local partners through the Regulations Technical Advisory Group to answer some of those questions.
Okay, and just to cover the 5,000 square feet. So area of disturbance, they may clear cut or completely dig up a whole lot, but the building itself is on only 80% of the lot, but it still includes the whole lot because you've disturbed the whole lot, right?
If you disturb more than 5,000 square feet in the process of building that lot, whether it's 10% of the lot or 100% of the lot, 5,000 square feet is 5,000 square feet. Yes.
Disturbance. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Neil, you have your hand up.
Just real quick, so a lot of properties you see in the urban areas, people start taking things like their downspouts and directing them at their neighbors' windows, or not having adequate they have fences across where streams or just drainage areas go on, which causes them to get clogged and cause flooding. Is there any consideration to address those in the stormwater manual, those type of issues?
From the aspects of a stormwater management plan, Neil, yes, that would be discharging onto a private property, not a publicly maintained system, and therefore, what's your adequate downstream conveyance analysis show you? But that's in the realm of a stormwater management plan. Where it's outside the realm of a stormwater management plan, that's a different question. I'll have to wait to answer that question. That's going to require more thought.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I move on? All right, we have time. So let's talk about environmental site design, which is the water quality and recharge components and the channel protection components. Next slide, please. Okay. Currently, environmental site design combines the water quality and recharge components, and we put a parenthesis around this because basically they're the same component. Recharge is a subset of water quality, and the channel protection volume requirements. ESD is implemented differently for new development and redevelopment projects. For new development, you are required to implement ESD to the maximum extent practicable to address the rainfall from the one-year storm. It's a sliding scale with a 1-inch minimum and a 2.7-inch maximum, as shown in tables in Chapter 5 of the Design Manual. For redevelopment, you are required to use ESD to address the runoff from 1 inch of rainfall for 50% of the redeveloped imperviousness and 100% of the new imperviousness is addressed as new development. However, if you can't implement ESD on a redevelopment project, there's a whole host of other options. A former boss of mine used to say there are more oars than a Viking longship. ESD, the water quality recharge and channel protection volumes must currently be treated in ESD practices first and all reasonable opportunities for using ESD practice must be exhausted before a structural practice is used. What we are proposing, we are going to separate the channel protection volume out from the water quality and recharge components of ESD. We are doing this to allow greater flexibility and resilience. The channel protection criteria will be based on the 1-year 24-hour design storm as it has been adjusted for climate change. It will be provided in structural practices. And again, it applies to new and redevelopment projects. The water quality and recharge components will be based on capturing and treating the runoff from 95% of the annual rainfall volume, or 2 inches for most of Maryland and 1.4 inches in that western zone. And it must be treated using ESD practices. Next slide, please. Why are we doing this? I just kind of hinted at this, but I'll say it again. ESD practices, and by this I mean what we typically call green stormwater infrastructure, green stormwater management practices, low impact development. Depending on the amount of water they capture and treat, they are not as effective or resilient for flood control. If they are located offline, they are not as resilient or effective for flood control. Bottom line is they're just not as effective and resilient for managing large volumes of water needed to manage flooding downstream. And we want to promote greater flexibility to how ESD is implemented across different development types. We understand there are issues with implementing ESD on single lots versus small subdivisions versus small commercial developments versus large industrial warehouse complexes. And we want to introduce some flexibility within the ESD requirements to allow this very positive requirement to be implemented more productively across the spectrum of development. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do to implement this now? Currently, the environmental site design requirements are found in Chapter 5 of the Design Manual. And this is the combination of water quality and recharge with the channel protection volume. The separation of the environmental site design criteria into a water quality and recharge component and a channel protection component will require modifying the design manual for the basic criteria for sizing practices. Currently, it's Table 5.3. That's not going to work anymore. Again, we just mentioned this. Standard plans currently exist for implementing ESD on single-family residential lots and agricultural developments. We're going to have to develop new guidance for implementing the new criteria in these areas. In other words, we're going to end in redeveloped areas. We're going to have to develop alternative compliance methods that allow this to be used more effectively on smaller scale sites where it's difficult to implement stormwater management. Next slide, please. Thank you. What must happen for an enhanced regulation proposal? Now we're digging more into the weeds. We will need to revise the BMP design criteria in chapters 3 and 5 and identify which practices may be used for ESD and which practices are really only structural practices. Excuse me. We need to analyze the ESD criteria and drainage area limitations within each of the practices in chapter 5 to determine whether they are doing what we intended them to do, and to promote greater flexibility for how practices are sized or located. Is it appropriate to allow rain gardens and bioretention facilities to be expanded in drainage area to call them ESD, as opposed to saying a larger bioretention facility divided up into 4 or 5 cells just to meet the ESD criteria? There's a certain level of practicality here. We need to consider developing criteria for offsetting areas where somebody cannot provide adequate treatment. This again falls under the standard of alternative compliance. And again, we have the standard plans out there, and we have other alternative compliance issues that need to be investigated. So these are all elements of the ESD criteria that we need to investigate before moving forward. And with that, I'll take another break for questions. Sure.
Sorry for asking.
No. Questions are always welcome.
I understand. Can't all be done at once. We have to have alternative plans. There's other groups thinking it through. It would be good to have some contemplation of the effects of cumulative development, especially in areas that are having more increase in density. And especially when, we need to increase density around transit ways in order to, reduce greenhouse gases, have more dense, fewer cars, that's all, etc. But it's an amount of disturbance that cumulatively will overwhelm the capacity of the stormwater system. So there's a tension there between the increasing the density and the being able to deal adequately with the drainage. So just puzzling through that and hoping that your technical work groups are figuring out ways to advise or help localities to figure out how to address that tension. Does that make sense?
Karen, it makes perfect sense. What you're talking about with cumulative impacts, what you're talking about is watershed capacity or watershed management. And, since the inception, since 1982, the stormwater management regulations apply to any development that disturbs more than 5,000 square feet. So we're dealing with the development by development pattern. Up until now, there wasn't much said about what happened once the water left the site, other than had to provide safe and stable conveyance to downstream receiving water. So you can see that we're beginning to get into this idea of the conveyance system being part of this and its importance in this process. But I cannot stress enough times how important watershed management plans are for these local storm drain systems where we are experiencing flooding now and where we may be experiencing flooding in the future due to climate change. And that is a process that we are talking with individuals about, the local jurisdictions, others, on how best to implement watershed management plans to start getting at some of these questions. And that's a parallel effort that we're doing right now. But we also recognize that while that effort is underway, we have to do something now. We can't wait for some of these questions to be answered. We have to get something into the books, not for the sake of get something proposed, but we need to start to address the situations where we can address them effectively, recognizing that there are some questions we may have to answer before we do more. The group that put together this presentation today, I'm going to say this for everyone before I end, we had this idea of what it takes to get you on the road. The small car there is perfectly acceptable for getting us on the road and getting us moving forward in implementing a new stormwater management program that's going to address some of these problems we're facing. However,
Yeah.
the larger car might be, down the road is going to be enhanced or a better ride. So we need to figure out, and that's what we've been asking you. And with that, if there are no other questions, it's a good segue into Ray's next talk about your comments back to us.
Okay, that's great. We can start with small electric vehicles. Thank you.
Is Trey?
Trey Porter.
Trey?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
So my question is kind of general. I know we're pretty far along in the process here, but have there been demonstrated efforts to determine whether or not the 1-inch quality treatment that we've been using for the past, well, since 2009, that it's not effective anymore? Because I feel like I understand the 90% capture based on the design of stormwater wetland systems. I understand that, and I understand that the data that was used for that 90% has changed, but it just seems to me like we're moving the needle on something without it demonstrated, showing that the previous design doesn't accomplish our objectives.
Okay, Trey, that's a good question. And I'm going to say that if you look at it purely as a perspective of water quality, that's one answer. But I'm going to go back to what I showed earlier in this presentation, which has been part of the regulations since the very beginning, which is this mimicking pre-development or natural hydrology. And I've been privy to looking at the files and finding old documents. Some of these date back to, believe it or not, I found documents referring to Maryland Stormwater Management Program dating back to 1961. And the evolution of this program, and the intent was all along, how do we get better at mimicking natural hydrology? Because if we can mimic natural hydrology, we can reduce a lot of our problems that way. The initial program did that by implementing or requiring infiltration to be implemented first and foremost before other practices were investigated. That was that statement. It pops up in a couple documents from the development of the original stormwater management program. However, infiltration was not the panacea that people thought it was. There were a lot of issues with where it was being implemented, and so people backed off of that, and they ended up in most cases providing 1/2 inch to 1 inch of water quality and a dry detention pond for quantity management. We recognized this was a problem, and in 2000 we changed that and required water quality, recharge, channel protection. So again, we're breaking down what the requirements for stormwater management into individual components, again, to try to mimic natural hydrology and manage flooding. It just so happens that when you look at natural systems, this 95% rainfall volume that we're going to, which is also implemented for federal projects across the country, lines up nicely with the onset of runoff in most natural conditions. So it's not as much a question of whether or not it's effective for water quality purposes. That's going to depend on how well the practices are designed to maintain, but we're also trying to get to that other component of mimicking natural systems. So the two components together, plus the idea that we're going to start promoting a more resilient process, lends itself very nicely to going with this in-between volume. It's not 3 inches, it's not 1 inch, it's 2 inches, or in Western Maryland, 1.4 inches. Again, that seems to be the sweet spot for meeting all of these different criteria.
Karen Metchus, would you like to add another question?
Yeah, sorry. So it seems to me, and this is not data driven, I can't prove it, but it seems to me that these larger homes are being built that's, with more, big basements, etc., that there's probably also an increase in the hydraulic pressure that's pushing water through the groundwater table. So it's sort of a different equation. I think I saw somewhere in your documents addressing groundwater, but I just wanted to put that out there if you had anything to say about it, or maybe that's something for the future. Just
that would be future steps. That right now it's more of what are they doing with the runoff from those types of development, and what are they doing with the land that they're developing. We'll get to some of those other issues. I mean, recharge has been a component since 2000. We think we hit that one pretty well in 2000. You can see we're not really changing it. What we are changing is apportioning these different requirements. In 2000 we said it's water quality, recharge, and channel protection. Then in 2009 we said it's all part of this ESD criteria. Well, now we're taking the channel protection requirement out of the ESD criteria, which still mimics natural hydrology, and taking the channel protection out to be more resilient and a little more flexible in its implementation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much.
Trey, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just quick follow up from the kind of the reason why I was asking that question too is mostly because the majority, I'm on the Eastern Shore in Queen Anne's County, and the majority of our we basically do the ESG to the MEP, and we don't really look at overbank or anything else unless there's existing flooding downstream that we're aware of. So basically, a lot of our development is going to be looking at a PE of 1.6, and so we're under the 2-inch for the water quality to begin with. Or, I'm sorry, for the ESD to begin with, and if you add the 2-inch water quality, it just seems like that. I'm speaking in terms of being pragmatic with some of the developers, but it seems like enlarging water quality treatment, those ESD features, which are rather expensive relative to the structural features, it seems like we're increasing volume in something that was never intended to treat volume. It seems like the ESD features were really, they weren't intended to do the heavy lifting in terms of the quantity.
Yeah, Trey, what I'll respond to you with this one is I don't want to go too far into the weeds here. We have a little time, but I don't want to go too far astray. Understand that when I mention for the enhanced program, for the basic program, we have to go into tables in Chapter 5 of the design manual. Currently, ESD practices are sized based on Table 5.3, which is a hybrid of a couple of different runoff control models. And with the change to splitting the ESD from the channel protection volume and increasing the ESD requirement to 2 inches, we can reduce that to using one runoff control model. And that's one of the things we need to develop, and that may actually address your issue. So, keep that in the back of your mind as you look at this and as we look at this moving forward, but that some of that may be addressed in as we implement the new criteria and change sections of the design manual. So right now you looked at Table 5.3, which is a cross between the simple method and TR55 or NRCS hydrology. The new tables will be based purely on NRCS hydrology, and so you might get a break on that as well. So again, it's some of the devil is in the details on how we're doing this. It'll be easier to implement to do this. We're investigating that. We hope to have some analyses that show that. But we're working on this moving forward with regulations tag and internally.
Stu.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ray.
And thank you for taking the brunt of the questions. As you know, Stu and I have different roles down here and different backgrounds and different perspectives. So if I may just take a moment or two to address some of the recent questions or comments. And Trey, to answer your question, if you go back and look at this law, in the very beginning of it, there was a lot of whereas statements about climate change, whereas statements about increasing amounts of runoff, whereas statements about we're also increasing downstream pollution to Chesapeake Bay TMDLs. And what is the department going to do to address increasing pollution? And I know a lot of what we're talking about here is about flooding and resilient infrastructure and things like that. But let's not forget about water quality. Water quality is important as well. So some of these measures of changing the water quality criteria and volumes is going to get at that, okay? Because we're doing a lot of restoration with the MS4 permits that you all are aware of. But we also have to stem the flow of new pollutants. And so, some of these smaller practices, ESD practices for water quality that we're making bigger, we're not necessarily making them bigger just for quantity management or flood resiliency, although they'll help with that. They're working towards water quality as well and stemming that flow. Karen, I like your questions. I think you're thinking like a watershed. And a lot of us down here are thinking like a watershed. And as you can imagine, there's just a ton of work to be done. And stormwater is just one component of this larger picture. It's something that we're adding more to the redevelopment so that we can get more from the redevelopment towards flood mitigation. But the answers are even bigger than that. And the answers are more looking at the entire watershed. And Sue's talked about the watershed as part of stormwater management. But there's also our efforts with our flood plain implementation programs, flood management programs. There's Office of Planning and where we're developing. And everybody's contributing to these flooding issues. It's not just the urban development. If you got agriculture in there, that can be added to it as well. So this is what Jennifer was really talking about, the bigger picture, looking at the watershed and with more data, developing more specific watershed management programs. And this is one where we feel like we've applied for some FEMA grants, and we're on the cusp of getting some of this money to prioritize watersheds across the state. And then once we prioritize those watersheds, we're going to go in and get that extra data that we need to find out what new development should be doing, to find out what the capacity of the system is, to find out where the bottlenecks are and where restoration projects might need to be placed within a watershed to help things out. So I really like your questioning, even going underground and looking at recharge and basements and blockages of underground flow, okay? You're really looking at the bigger picture, and it's that bigger picture that we need to get at if we're gonna once and for all resolve flooding in the state of Maryland. So just wanted to add those 2 cents and a little bit different perspective on some of these things. What I wanted to do here in closing, we've got 17 or 18 minutes left, was to kind of circle back, because even within the stormwater regulatory update, there's a bunch of options that we have, a bunch of options that we laid on the table for you, and for the for the stakeholders that we need to consult with, and for the public at large, and for the local county governments that are on board. We need to hear from you. What makes sense at this point in time for us to move forward with? What needs more time for development? And if we do move ahead, are we okay with the standard proposals that Stu was talking about, or do we want to go more towards this Cadillac version that Stu is showing here? And the bottom line is that we need to hear from each of the stakeholders, and how exactly do we make this happen? Sometimes it seems so overwhelming and daunting that we need a little bit of magic here as well. And Karen, I want to say I appreciate your comment. Maybe we got these vehicles in reverse order. Maybe what we're heading for is that smaller electric car, not this large, probably gas guzzling car, adding emissions, to
Right.
the air.
Right on.
Okay, so the regulations that we move forward with will largely depend on our capacity to do them well. And it's all of us that are in this room right now. The last time that we did a full overhaul of the regulations, it took us 5 years from beginning to end, and that was with a funding source. So we've talked about this a lot today. I can see us reasonably moving forward with updating precipitation data. And if we take on some easy tasks, we might even be able to do this by the end of the year. And as I say that, I know that Stu and Jennifer are kicking me under the table. And I think that we've also seen that managing for flood risks and making ESD more resilient to climate change is going to take some more investment and time. Should we move ahead with both of these at this point in time? Would you prioritize one of these over another? Are there portions of these proposals that we can move forward with now? Another option, Jennifer talked at the very beginning about the low-hanging fruit. Do we want to pursue a phased approach where we do the precipitation update now and then work together as a stormwater community on the more complicated regulatory changes? I also want for the stakeholders and also for the public to be aware that we tried to hit on the major regulatory proposals, and we tried to focus this on quantity management and flooding today. But there are additional things, proposals that we put out there that are in your supporting documents that we did not go over in this presentation. So please be sure to go back and read through them all and comment on the entire package. We've been at this for 2 years. Again, Jennifer had that timeline. We started this around this time in 2022. Now is the time to move forward without delay. And we need your input. So please, please, please let us know your thoughts on all of this. And I just want to recognize, I saw Amy Stevens had some questions, and Eric Michelson. You know, I want to recognize our counterparts at the county governments and the municipal governments. This is going to be a huge lift. It's going to be a huge lift for us coming up with model ordinances. It's going to be a huge lift for the local county and municipal governments, updating their ordinances and getting them through their legislative process, getting them approved. There are schedules in our regulatory proposal, and hopefully we're allowing enough time for all of this administrative work and the guidance documents to be completed. But we are interested in hearing from you on these aspects as well. So what are the next steps? For the stakeholders, we need for you to provide us with your comments on these proposed regulations by May 7th. The public, you may comment at any time, but the sooner the better, right? So that the department has the time that it needs to take your comments into consideration. And then based on all of these comments, the department's going to be making some tough decisions on what regulations to proceed with now. And then we're going to draft our final set of regulatory proposals. This may take several months or longer, depending on which options we choose to go with. At that time, we'll reconvene the stakeholder group and have another open public meeting to share the final set of regulations. And this future stakeholder meeting is going to fulfill the department's obligations under the law to share the final regulations with the stakeholder group and post the promulgation process on our website 6 months prior to proposing them in the Maryland Register. And with that, I want to thank everybody once again very much for your attendance today and helping us with this very important regulatory update. And I just wanted to allow Jennifer, Stu, I do see that some of our director's office, Lee Curry, director of the Water and Science Administration, is online. So if anybody from the director's office, Devin or Matt, who joined us today, thank you for joining us. If you all have anything that you want to add, now would be a good time, or Jennifer or Stu.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or actually good morning, everyone. This is Lee Curry, Director of the Water and Science Administration. I just want to thank the team here, the work that Jennifer, Ray, Stu, and others have put into this. It's really important from a flood resiliency standpoint for protecting our communities, thinking about environmental justice, thinking about climate resiliency. I also want to thank the stakeholders that are on the call today. I've talked with several of you offline in between these meetings. Really appreciate your time, your effort, your thinking that goes into this. I can't emphasize enough how important your comments are in shaping this. We will get to the goal line. We do want to move this forward. I have been briefing so the secretary on this, so she's well aware of this and is in support of, again, resiliency in Maryland and keeping Marylanders, their homes, their properties safe and secure, looking at redevelopment and future development as part of this regulation. So with this, again, thanks for all the thinking that went into this. Thanks to the team for shaping this based on the feedback that we have received. And I know I will be looking forward to your feedback and comments, which was, I think the date was set at May 7th. So with that, Again, thank you, Jennifer, Ray, team, and the stakeholders. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Lee. Anyone else? Going once. Going twice. This meeting is adjourned.